There's some stories you read online and forget 5 minutes later. Then there are stories that stay with you. Not because they involve ghosts, not because someone saw a monster in the woods, but because underneath everything, there is one terrifying question. What if the person standing in front of you looks like someone you love, but somehow isn't the same person anymore? This story was originally posted by a man in his early 30s. He wasn't looking for attention. He wasn't claiming to have seen aliens. And he specifically said he wasn't suffering from any mental illness. He just wanted to know what had happened to his younger brother. Because after a year-long trip overseas, his brother came home. But according to him, it felt like his brother had stayed behind. The family lived in a quiet town in northern Vermont. The older brother, who we'll call Ethan, was 31. His younger brother, Ryan, was 21. The two had never been especially close. They weren't enemies. They simply lived very different lives. Ethan had settled down, gotten married, and started working full-time. Ryan was the opposite. He had recently finished college and decided to take a year off. His plan was simple: travel, see the world, figure out what he wanted to do with his life. He started in Southeast Asia and eventually spent most of his time in Vietnam. At first, everything seemed normal. Ryan sent his parents photos. He told them about places he'd visited. He talked about food, hostels, beaches, and people he'd met. But gradually, the messages became less frequent. Then, almost non-existent, his parents started worrying. During that year, they contacted the U.S. Embassy several times because they couldn't figure out where Ryan was. Each time, Ryan eventually turned up. And each time, he insisted everything was fine. So the family tried not to panic. Eventually, Ryan told them he was coming home. His parents were thrilled. They planned a family dinner. Ethan decided to meet him at the airport. And that's where the story became strange. Ethan later described the moment he saw Ryan walking through the airport. At first, he didn't recognize him. Ryan had lost an enormous amount of weight. He looked exhausted. His clothes were dirty. His hair was long and unkempt. And there was something else. Something Ethan couldn't immediately explain. Ryan looked empty. Not sad. Not angry. Just disconnected. As if he was physically present, but mentally somewhere else. Ethan watched him walk toward the family. His mother started crying. She hugged him. Ryan barely reacted. His father shook his hand. Ryan nodded. Then Ethan stepped forward. He expected some kind of joke, maybe a hug, maybe a sarcastic comment about how much older they had all gotten. Instead, Ryan simply looked at him and said nothing. Ethan later wrote that it felt like looking at a stranger who happened to have his brother's face. He tried to convince himself that Ryan was simply exhausted. Maybe he had been traveling too long. Maybe he'd had a terrible experience overseas. Maybe he was sick. There had to be a normal explanation. But over the next 2 weeks, that explanation became harder and harder to believe. Ryan's sleeping schedule completely changed. He slept during the day. At night, he stayed awake for hours, sometimes until sunrise. His parents would hear noises coming from his bedroom, something being moved, something hitting the floor, occasionally loud banging. When they asked him what he was doing, he wouldn't explain. Sometimes he barely answered at all. And when he did speak, his voice was so quiet that his parents had to ask him to repeat himself.
His sentences didn't make much sense. He would start talking about one subject, then suddenly switch to something completely unrelated. He stopped showering. He barely ate. He rarely left his room. And he began locking the door. His mother became afraid of him. That detail bothered Ethan more than anything else, because his mother had always been incredibly close to Ryan. She had been the person he called when he was sick, the person he called when he was lonely, the person he called when he needed money. Yet now, she was afraid to knock on his bedroom door. Ethan started looking for explanations. The first possibility was drugs. Maybe Ryan had become addicted to something while traveling. Maybe he'd experienced some kind of psychotic episode. Maybe he'd been traumatized. Maybe he had developed a serious mental illness. There were plenty of possibilities. But Ethan couldn't shake one thought. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. And then he learned something that made the situation even stranger. Before Ryan left for Vietnam, he had been extremely clean. Almost obsessively clean. He hated germs. He washed his hands constantly. He couldn't stand being around dirty surfaces. But the person who returned was the complete opposite. He didn't seem to care about his appearance at all. He didn't seem to care about food. He didn't seem to care about sleep. He didn't even seem to care that his family was terrified. It was as if the person who had left the United States had gradually disappeared, and something else had taken his place. Then, Ethan discovered something about Ryan's trip that his parents hadn't told him. And suddenly, the entire story became much darker. During the trip, Ryan had been traveling with 2 young women. They had apparently been moving between different parts of Vietnam together. At some point, the 3 of them were supposed to return to Vietnam after visiting another area. But they never arrived. Days passed, then more days. Their phones stopped responding. Nobody knew where they were. Ryan's parents contacted local authorities, and according to what they were told, officials feared that the 3 travelers may have been kidnapped. There were concerns they could have been trafficked across the border into Laos. For nearly 2 weeks, Ryan was effectively missing. Then, somehow, he came back. The family never got a clear explanation of exactly what had happened. They didn't know where he'd been, they didn't know who he'd been with, and they didn't know what had happened to the 2 women. Ryan apparently refused to talk about it. At least, not in any way that made sense. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about that. 2 weeks missing, possible kidnapping, possible human trafficking. And then Ryan comes home looking like a completely different person. There was no way to know what he'd experienced. But Ethan began wondering whether the real story had started long before Ryan arrived back in America. Maybe whatever happened in Vietnam had changed him. Maybe physically, maybe psychologically, or maybe something even worse had happened. Something he couldn't remember, something he couldn't explain, or something he was too afraid to tell his family. Eventually, the family agreed that Ryan needed professional help. They arranged a psychiatric evaluation. But before the appointment could happen, Ryan disappeared. It happened during the night. His parents noticed the next morning. His bedroom was empty. Nobody knew where he had gone. His phone wasn't helping. His family didn't want to call the police. They were terrified of what would happen if the story became public. Ethan understood their fear. But he also understood something else. Ryan was no longer simply a strange young man who had returned from a difficult trip. He was missing. He was severely disturbed. And nobody knew. But what happened next is the part Ethan said he would never forget. Ryan was found dead. And suddenly, all those strange details from the previous weeks took on a completely different meaning. The sleeping during the day, the endless nights, the noises behind the locked door, the whispering, the refusal to eat, the filthy clothes, the strange behavior, the disappearance, everything. Ethan later wrote that he couldn't stop thinking about one sentence. It felt like his brother had already died in Vietnam, and that the person who came home was only the body of the person he used to know. He knew that wasn't literally true. At least, he knew there was no rational evidence for it. But grief isn't rational. Sometimes the mind creates its own explanation for something it simply cannot accept. And Ethan couldn't accept that the brother he remembered could disappear so completely while still being alive. His final message about the story was heartbreaking. He said his parents were taking his brother's death harder than anyone. They kept thinking about the 20 years they had spent raising him, about everything they had planned for his future. Ethan, however, said something different. He remembered the brother Ryan had been before the trip. Funny, energetic, the kind of person who could walk into a room and make everyone else feel more alive. And despite everything that happened, Ethan was grateful that his brother's suffering had finally ended. But there was still one question he couldn't answer. What happened to Ryan in Vietnam? Because whatever happened during those missing 2 weeks, Ryan never came home from it. Not really. And that would already be disturbing enough. But the next story is worse. Because this time, the person being watched knew exactly who was watching him. And the stranger didn't disappear after one encounter. He kept coming back. He stood outside the house. He looked through the windows. He followed the family. And eventually, he called their phone at 2 a.m, asking one simple question. Are you home right now? There are some things you can explain away. A stranger parked on your street. Someone looking at your house. A wrong number phone call. Even seeing the same person twice can be a coincidence.
But what if the same stranger keeps appearing? And every time he does, he seems to know exactly where you are. That was the situation Daniel Carter found himself in after moving into a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. Daniel and his wife, Megan, had recently bought their first house. They were expecting their first child. For the first few weeks, everything felt perfect. A new home, a new neighborhood, a baby on the way. Nothing seemed unusual until one Tuesday afternoon. Daniel was pulling out of his garage when he noticed a man standing beside a parked Toyota Camry. The man wasn't doing anything. He wasn't talking on the phone. He wasn't loading groceries. He was just standing there, watching Daniel. There are some things you can explain away. A stranger parked on your street, someone looking at your house, a wrong number phone call. Even seeing the same person twice can be a coincidence. But what if the same stranger keeps appearing? And every time he does, he seems to know exactly where you are. That was the situation Daniel Carter found himself in after moving into a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. Daniel and his wife, Megan, had recently bought their first house. They were expecting their first child. For the first few weeks, everything felt perfect. A new home. At first, Daniel assumed the guy was lost, so he rolled down the window. "Hey, you need something?" The man looked at him, then calmly said, "No, sir. Have a good day." That should have been the end of it. But Daniel had a strange feeling. Something about the man's expression bothered him. So Daniel asked him to move along. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, staring. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling. He called his workplace and said he wasn't feeling well. Then he called the police. When the officers arrived, Daniel explained what had happened. The officers didn't think there was enough evidence to do anything. But they did offer one possibility. The stranger could have been checking out the neighborhood. Maybe he was looking for a house to burglarize. It wasn't impossible. Burglars sometimes watch houses before breaking into them. Daniel accepted the explanation. It made sense. So he bought a home security system, several cameras, motion sensors, everything he could reasonably install. And for a while, nothing happened. Days passed. Then, weeks. Daniel and Megan slowly relaxed. They started feeling comfortable again. Maybe the stranger had simply been some random guy. Maybe the police were right. Maybe it was nothing. Then, Sunday came. Daniel was sitting in the living room watching a football game. The Chiefs were playing the Browns. His wife was somewhere else in the house. The room was dark, except for the television. Daniel glanced toward the window and froze. Someone was standing outside. It was him, the same man. The stranger was looking directly through the glass, directly at Daniel. And then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. He started laughing. Daniel's stomach dropped. He immediately reached for the gun he kept in the house. But when he looked back toward the window, the man was gone. Daniel checked every door, every window. Nothing. He called the police again. This time, there was camera footage. The officers took the recording and said they would try to identify the man. But Daniel couldn't stop thinking about one thing. The stranger hadn't tried to break in. He hadn't stolen anything. He hadn't even touched the house. He had simply stood outside the window and laughed. It felt intentional. He wanted Daniel to see him. He wanted Daniel to know that he could get close whenever he wanted. That night, Daniel and Megan made a decision. They left the house. They went to stay with relatives. They told themselves it would only be temporary, just until the police figured out who the man was. But that night, something happened that changed everything. Around 2 a.m., Daniel's phone rang. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. Then he answered. There was silence. Daniel said, "Hello?" Nothing. Then a man's voice. Quiet, calm, almost casual. "Are you home right now?" Daniel's blood went cold. He immediately asked, "Who is this?" The line went dead. Daniel called the police. He told them about the phone call, but there wasn't much they could do. The number was unknown. There was no name, no obvious connection to the stranger. No threat had technically been made. But Daniel knew what the question meant. The man wasn't asking where Daniel lived. He already knew. He wasn't asking whether Daniel was safe. He was asking whether Daniel was home. The next morning, Daniel started thinking about everything that had happened. The stranger knew where they lived. He knew when Daniel was home. He had somehow gotten close enough to look through the living room window. And now, someone had his phone number. That detail made the situation much more personal. Daniel started asking himself, how did this man find me? He went back through everything. Friends, work, neighbors, the house purchase, the real estate agent, anything that could have exposed his phone number. Then, someone online suggested something Daniel hadn't considered. Maybe the stranger wasn't interested in the house at all. Maybe he was interested in them. One person suggested contacting the previous owners, find out who had lived there, ask if anyone had been angry about the sale. Maybe someone had wanted the house. Maybe a relative had expected to inherit it. Maybe another buyer had lost the property during the bidding process. Daniel remembered something. There had been another person bidding on the house, and the negotiations had become surprisingly aggressive. At the time, Daniel hadn't thought much about it. Now, he wasn't so sure. But another comment made him think even harder. Someone asked Daniel whether his wife had any connection to politics. At first, it seemed like a ridiculous question. Then Daniel thought about it. His wife, Megan, was a successful local business owner, but she was also a member of the county council. And there was something else. She was a Democrat. Their town was overwhelmingly conservative. Megan was one of the few Democratic politicians in the area. During her campaign, Daniel had helped her. He had handed out flyers, talked to voters, attended local events, and given his phone number to a lot of people. Suddenly, the mysterious phone call didn't seem quite so random. Maybe someone had found Daniel's number through the campaign. Maybe the stranger wasn't a burglar. Maybe the house had nothing to do with it. Daniel told his wife what he was thinking. Neither of them wanted to believe it. They had a baby coming.
They didn't want politics anywhere near their home. But now, there was a stranger appearing outside their house, and someone calling them in the middle of the night. So Daniel went back to the police. He explained everything. The officers took the situation more seriously this time. They reviewed the Ring camera footage again. And eventually, they found the man. His identity was finally confirmed. And when he learned who he was, the entire situation became much darker. The man wasn't simply some random burglar. He was connected to an extremist political movement, a group that had been targeting political opponents online. And Megan's political views appeared to have made her a target. Daniel suddenly understood why the stranger had wanted them afraid. He hadn't been trying to rob the house. He had been trying to send a message. We know where you live.
The police arrested the man after he was caught trespassing on the property. They also discovered that he was wanted in connection with another case. For the first time in weeks, Daniel and Megan felt like they could breathe. But there was still one problem. They were about to bring a newborn baby home, and Daniel couldn't stop wondering, what if this wasn't over? The police told them that the cameras and security measures around the house made them much safer. They promised to monitor possible threats. But Daniel knew something had changed permanently. A house is supposed to be the one place where you feel safe. For him, that feeling was gone. And all it took was one stranger standing outside a window and smiling. But the strangest part of the story wasn't the stranger. It was how quickly everyone around Daniel had started searching for logical explanations. A burglar, a disgruntled buyer, a political argument, a mentally unstable person. Each made sense on its own, but when you put all of them together, the truth was much more disturbing. Because sometimes, the person watching you doesn't want your money. They don't want your car. They don't even necessarily want to hurt you. Sometimes, they just want you to know that they're there. And that can be enough to make you afraid of your own home. Especially when the phone rings at 2 a.m. and the voice on the other end